This is Sumiko Saulson. I am presenting on elements of horror in Toni Morrison's use of magical realism and African American folklore. And this is from an essay of that name from by myself from 2017, which won the second place Carry the Light award. Okay. Born Chloe Ardelia Wolford in 1931. Toni Morrison is one of the most prominent voices in African American literature. Now, at the time I wrote this, essay, she was 84 years of age, but she has since passed away. And since I watched The Pieces That I Am, which is a documentary that Toni Morrison put together just before she passed away, I am very aware of the struggle that she actually went through establishing herself as the Pulitzer Prize winning, Nobel Prize winning author that she was, and that she ended up having to actually stand up to people who were on her own team and were telling her that she shouldn't continue to write about African Americans because she was not going to be successful. And as we all know, she became very successful doing that. But one thing that has occurred to me before, and certainly since writing this essay and since watching that movie, is how Beloved, which was a ghost story, which was what she ended up winning all of these awards for, was not considered for anything like a Horror Writers Association Stoker Award at that time, because people didn't really look at it as a horror story. But it is, in fact, a horror story, and that is what I'm actually here establishing. So, the best-selling author won Nobel and Pulitzer Prizes and earned an enduring place in American hearts and minds. She has become a staple of college English literature course curriculum in her own lifetime. She became one in her own lifetime. Of course, she's passed on since. Although her works often defy genre classification, Respectability Politics has her firmly ensconced in the literary fiction genre, which is considered to be, of course, respectable. She is a darling of critics and the academia. Horror and supernatural are considered low-class, low-brow, tawdry genres. They sit in a dirty little niche with romance and erotica. Genre prejudice is so deeply ingrained, many refuse to recognize a horror story when they see one. Toni Morrison's Beloved is an American Gothic horror story, a ghost story set against a backdrop of slavery and the post-Civil War restoration. It takes on a tone of Gothic horror immediately with the line, 124 was spiteful, full of baby venom, referring to 124 Bluestone Road, the protagonist's home. The venomous baby is Beloved, petulant spirit of the 2-year-old daughter Seth they murdered to protect her from the threat of being returned unto slavery. Now, haunted old buildings take on a life of their own in the Gothic horror genre, so that is actually part of the Gothic genre, all told, is buildings that are personified. So buildings have their own personality in Gothic literature, in Gothic horror, and also in specifically American Gothic horror. Okay, so American Gothic horror takes place during the Civil War and the Restoration, which are concurrent with Britain's Victorian age. The dark history of the African slave trade, Native American genocide, and white guilt are central to the genre of American Gothic horror. And, hence in these stories, the wrong native persons, the oppressed African slaves, and, other people who have been, wronged through the, oppression of colonialism, through manifest destiny. They become the boogeymen in these stories because people who are writing them are afraid of, being haunted or being attacked by those who they have wronged. So, Toni Morrison took this genre trope and flipped it on its end by writing a story where an African American who had been enslaved and had been freed from slavery murdered a child in order to keep her child from becoming a slave, and then was haunted by her child. So this is, really a metaphor about how African Americans are haunted by slavery, and how not just those who enslaved us, but, we as slaves are traumatized and haunted by what happened. And, if you see the movie Pieces that I Am, she tells the story about how she read a story about how this actually happened. And, when it happened, they actually put the woman on trial for murder, but she was found not guilty because the child was not considered to be a person, because the child was a slave and therefore considered property. Therefore, the murder was not a murder because she killed some, property. In fact, in this horrible, occurrence is what became this horror story. So when, you look at these things are actually horrid. They're very, 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 very horrifying things that have happened to us, to African Americans through slavery. And to make it into a horror story, of course, makes a lot of sense. And American Gothic horror, black horror in this genre is, is their stories where we as African Americans take horrible things that have happened to us and then we turn them around to show how we are terrified both by what is happening to us in the society and, by things that are scary. I'm in a course right now, which is Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes' course, The Sunken Place, which, talks about the black experience and the horror genre. And the first thing that they have you look at is this horrible movie that talks about slavery. And Toni Morrison is not the only author who has done this, who has taken things that, in mainstream horror are things that, the white protagonist is afraid of, and then flip them over so that the narrative is now about African Americans and what we fear. In Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes' course, The Sunken Place, which, the title comes from the Jordan Peele movie, obviously. They talk about this. They talk about what is the African American experience as far as horror goes, and they have you look at a bunch of classic horror movies, black horror movies, and they suggest that the first African American horror movie was Birth of a Nation, which is this terrible piece of propaganda that is a revisionist history of the South, where they, try to convince people that the South was noble. The noble South narrative that they have is one where they, of course, show African Americans who were enslaved as being horrible, brutal people, and also try to create this narrative where we were benefited somehow by slavery, which which is a load of crap. But in order to create a revisionist history, where the South was the good guys and the South was not predominantly interested in slavery, but even if they were interested in slavery, it was for our own good. Okay, this is actually pretty horrifying. This is pretty terrifying, and that's why they suggest that you look at this in terms of something like a black horror film. What is horrible to African Americans? When I put together my book 60 Black Women in Horror and later followed it up with 100 plus Black Women in Horror, I took a lot of stories and took a close look at them and looked at how they were actually a part of the horror genre. And Octavia Butler's Fledgling was one of the other ones that I looked at. It talked about how this vampire was being persecuted because she had been genetically engineered to have dark skin, which made it so that she could walk around in the daytime. You know what I'm saying? And, yeah, like Blade, but, Octavia Butler did this, right? And, not Marvel. And, the idea that Octavia Butler was writing horror is something that, I think picked up some steam because she has won a posthumous Bram Stoker Award for Kindred as a graphic novel. So, people's minds are actually being changed over time so that people actually do accept that these things are in fact horror stories, and these things are in fact a legitimate part of the genre. But that's not, how people start out. So, back to Toni Morrison and this essay. Toni Morrison's primary genre is African American literary fiction, but she is associated also with magical realism, and also Afro Surrealism. She is the most famous of the Afro Surrealist writers. Magical realism is a genre which inserts folklore and supernatural elements into otherwise realistic narratives. And you see this in a bunch of Toni Morrison stories. So, Beloved is not Toni Morrison's only overt venture into magical realism. There's A Song of Solomon, Sula, Jazz, and The Bluest Eye. All of them use elements from this genre. Now, Sula is a Nobel Prize winning story utilizing magical realism, which I would also consider to be a horror story. Okay? Supernatural events illustrate the town of Bottoms, discomposure over the unconventional Sula peace. These magical elements are illustrations of the town's scapegoating behavior. They symbolize the demonization of women for liberal, sexually unrepressed behavior. There is some semblance between Sula's connection with the paranormal occurrences and witchcraft. Sula seems to be a witch, and the town seems to be literally, as well as figuratively on a witch hunt. So, they're upset about her licentious behavior. This movie, occurs in a period of time where sexual liberation was something that was, freeing for white women, and Sula wants a piece of the pie. So, at the end of this book, it's the 1960s, and she's in trouble for doing things like sleeping around, sleeping with married people, and people are coming at her in all kinds of different ways. But while they come at her, all of this weird stuff is happening. Weird groups of birds come and start attacking people in this town, and all kinds of just everything's off. Everything's sort of wrong. Okay? Now, when you think about horror movies like, Hitchcock's The Birds, and even horror movies like The Omen, you have this same kind of occurrence going on, and people know that it's horror. But when you have a story that is, inserting magical realism, people do not necessarily immediately register it as horror. So, The strange appearance of a swarm of agitated birds upon Sula's return is a great example of this. They arrive in such unmanageable numbers that the townspeople are driven to sadism to get rid of them. They are so populous, the birds create a danger to themselves and others. The book never explains their mysterious arrival and disappearance. That is where magical realism differs from traditional horror. In horror, a cause, usually a diabolical one, is assigned. In Sula, people superstitiously connect the appearance to the protagonist and her sexually loose moral behavior, and her interracial relationships, and her affairs with married women. Okay? But there's no actual proof that she's a witch and that something supernatural is going on, so you're left to kind of wonder. In magical realism, such things are symbolic, whereas in horror, they are literal. Okay? However, if you look at Sula and you look at other stories like Song of Solomon, they delve into folklore. And, like Song of Solomon, right at the beginning, it starts out with the folklore about the Igbo people who liberated themselves from slavery by flying off of the slave ship. And it talks about, well, did they really fly, or did they just jump off and drown and die? And this is a bit of folklore that is very well known and very popular. The same folklore is in the Black Panther. Killmonger says that his relatives were not enslaved because they were the ones that flew off the ship. And then, spoiler alert, he dies, okay? And from, his point of view, what he's saying is that it's better to die than to be enslaved. But there was folklore, where they literally flew away and they literally rescued themselves from slavery. And this theme is all throughout Song of Solomon, along with a whole bunch of other things that are very supernatural, such as Pilate not having any belly button, which would be something that would occur with something like Nephilim, I think, someone that was, of an angelic birth, or someone who was created and not born at all. And so all of these kind of creepy things are in these books, but they are never explicitly, said to be real. There is always a sort of doubt. Is this really happening? Is it not really happening? And we all know that that's a type of horror story. Okay, really, we know this is a type of horror. And, when I started talking about how these are horror stories, a lot of people were like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's true. You're right, these are horror stories. But of course there were people who were like, oh no, horror is a crappy genre and Toni Morrison would never be associated with anything like that. But Beloved clearly is a horror story. It makes no pretenses about being anything other than a horror story. Okay? So, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon opens up with some of the most horrifying scenes I've ever read. One involves the hunting of a runaway slave by a pack of dogs, and the other involves an extended analogy about leaping to suicide while attempting to fly away from enslavement. Okay? Song of Solomon uses several elements of magical realism. Many of these are connected to the character Pilate, a woman born without a belly button. She is a guardian angel, Earth Mother figure in the life of the protagonist, Milkman. Her lack of a navel suggests a supernatural origin because belly buttons are a sign of earthly birth. Created creatures like angels or golem wouldn't need navels. Pilate shows signs of supernatural knowledge also, and power, and does, as does the ancient former slave Circe. Circe tells Milkman of his great-grandfather Solomon. Solomon was said to have literally flown to escape slavery. So, clearly he was still living, he procreated, and he flew away and he escaped slavery. However, throughout the story, various attempts at flight are both ambiguous and tragic. Okay? People try to fly and they die. So in this story, there are a whole bunch of tragic deaths, but still, in this, as in many of the stories that use magical realism, there are things that are going on that are clearly supernatural or that do seem to be supernatural, such as Pilot not having a navel at all and people having arcane knowledge that they should not have. Okay, and this is in a lot of different books by Toni Morrison. For example, in Jazz, another favorite book of mine by Toni Morrison, which doesn't happen to be in the essay that I wrote, there are a whole bunch of ancestor spirits of the protagonist, Violet, that keep showing up. And they're either actually ghosts or they would have to be extremely, unnaturally long-lived. I think that they probably are actually ghosts that she's communicating with. And, the subject of mental illness is definitely, something that is sort of woven into this particular narrative and, also into some other stories, such as Love and The Bluest Eye, because she does deal with difficult, subject matter and subject matters that are related to trauma. In this particular story, Violet is a woman in her 50s. Her husband, Joe, has cheated on her with a girl that's, a young adult, still really a teenager, like a 19-year-old girl named Dorcas, who died. And, her husband was actually accused of killing this girl, in fact, and it's tragic. But Violet is so jealous of the girl that she tries to destroy her body while, she goes to her funeral and tries to destroy her body and gets the nickname Violent because she has attacked this girl and tried to destroy her body. So the girl who died, Dorcas, is a girl with an absentee father who is a light-skinned biracial girl. And, Violet is a dark-skinned woman who is much older, and that's why there's this jealousy and this anger. But it's really displaced anger against Joe, her husband. Still she's trying to destroy this dead girl's body, and she goes on this sort of journey to try to come to terms with herself and come to terms with her own bloodline and her ancestors in her bloodline, including some that were, biracial, because they're, like many African Americans, there were ancestors of hers who had plantation owners, plantation lords, slave owners are in her bloodline. So she comes to terms with this over the course of the story, and these ancestor spirits are showing up, and they're near, part of the narrative. They're just actually talking to her. Is she crazy? I don't think she is. I think these are actually ghosts. And at least one of them seems like maybe he's just someone who is incredibly long-lived. So, yeah, another example of this. In Toni Morrison's controversial debut novel, The Bluest Eye, Piccola Breedlove, a sexually molested young black girl, retreats into a fantasy world where she feels beautiful because she imagines that she has blue eyes. The book has been banned multiple times because it deals with these difficult subjects, such as incest and child molestation. However, at the core of it is a deeper truth. Our most terrifying monsters are the ones that are real. These are horrors that the human must endure, or that the human endures, that destroy minds and destroy lives. And in this case, the young woman's mind has been destroyed and she is living in a fantasy world. Horror as a genre allows its readers to confront subjects that are, often too hard to look at directly. Like a filter that allows us to look at the sun without going blind, horror softens the impact of unimaginable subjects, replacing horrific human monsters with supernatural creatures. There is a close synergy between magical realism and American Gothic horror. They are flip sides of the same coin. Magical realism is a genre label ascribed to people of color talking about ourselves, integrating our own folklore, history, legends, mythology into stories that contain realistic and fantastic elements. American Gothic, as written from a white person's point of view, is traditional or mainstream American Gothic. But, that has to do with outsider fear and suspicion of the same folklore, history, legends, and myths. So, in a traditional Gothic horror story, magic is universally feared because it's written by people who are Christians, who are afraid of things. That's why you get things like the monkey's paw. Afraid of this strange magic by these other people who are going to come back to haunt them. Okay? However, in magical realism, the magic is not always bad. And the same thing goes with actual, horror that is written by African Americans and people in the African diaspora. It does not always have magic as evil, and it in fact makes distinctions between magic that is good magic and magic that is evil or bad magic. So there is both positive and negative in these, forces, because, what happens is that you're dealing with different other religions that, are not feared by these people, because these people, are adherents or believers in these religions, or are just educated that these are the religions of their ancestors. In essence, if Beloved had been written by a white author, and if the protagonist was white, it would have automatically been considered a horror story if Sethe was not an African American woman, but was a white woman, say, being haunted by the ghost of a dead little black girl who had been killed to prevent her from becoming a slave again. Okay? Automatically, people would have seen this as a Gothic horror story. The various elements in Sula, for example, can be symbolic. And at the same time, it can also be a horror story. They could be literal magic. They could be literal magic things that are occurring as a reaction to something that is going on that is unnatural, that is somehow changing the flight patterns of birds. They could be actual magic that's being practiced by someone who is, in fact, a witch of some sort who is conjuring these things up. So it can actually be both things. And, what we're looking at now is that we have actually gotten to the point where people can see things that, African American and African diaspora authors such as Toni Morrison put together as a legitimate part of the horror genre, and that just because we are using folklore of our ancestors in a way that is positive, and we don't have it always as something negative or always as something that's other than us or something that we are horrified by, that does not mean that they do not actually have a legitimate place in the horror genre.